about the loss of vineyards and of our agriculture. It would all make sense if we only knew the historical events underpinning this. Now we move to the next section, the oracles concerning Egypt. And this is the last of our sections we're looking at, chapters 19 and 20. Again, these are difficult passages under the Egypt heading. The first, a poem, chapter 19, verses 1 to 15, coming mainly from the time of Isaiah himself, when Sebo, the envoy of Pharaoh, Tephanesh, was trying to organize a coalition against Assyria. Egypt and Assyria, two great powers. The second piece, written in prose, chapter 19, verses 16 to 25, comes from a much later period when Jewish migrants have settled in the Nile Delta and are living there. It's an amazing ecumenical piece, for God reverses the whole Exodus and becomes the liberator of the suffering and oppressed Egyptians, whom he calls, stunningly, my people. And then the third section, again in prose, chapter 20, verses 1 to 6, is the story of a prophetic action or sign performed by Isaiah at the time of Assyria, actually the king Sargon II of Assyria, in 711 BC. Okay, let's have a brief look at each of these. The poem in chapter 19, verses 1 to 15. The first stanza pictures Yahweh riding on a swift cloud. That's an image we come across in the Psalms. A common image for God in the ancient Near East. In the text of a very famous city, Ugarit, an ancient port city in modern-day Syria, we have discovered two ancient libraries of clay tablets written in 4 different languages and coming from the period 1200 BC. We say roughly around the time of Moses, and which tells us of the way the Canaanites worshipped their god Baal. Well, in these texts, Baal is described as the cloud rider, the one who rides on the clouds. And as we mentioned, it's in the Psalms. Psalm 104 verse 3 says, "You stretch the heavens out like a tent. You build your palace on the waters above." Don't forget the waters above, the waters beneath the earth. "Coming on the cloud as your chariot, you advance in the wings of the wind." It's a beautiful image, as common as we said in the whole of the Middle East. The Lord then causes internal strife, and we know from history, the history of Egypt, there was constant internal strife between Upper and Lower Egypt. He causes confusion amongst the royal counselors and then hands Egypt over to a lord, master, a cruel king. To a hard master rather, and a cruel king. Isn't it a little bit of irony if we remember the book of Exodus, how the Jews were treated by a hard master and a cruel king? The next stanza shows us what happens when the yearly floods in Egypt don't occur and the Nile dries up. It's disaster. Disaster on an extraordinary scale. The farmer, the fisherman, the textile worker, the labourer are all profoundly affected. It's economic ruin. And the last stanza is a taunt against Egypt's vaunted claims to be the true source of wisdom. That's God's prerogative to be the wise one. The princes of Zoan refers to the delta city of Tanis, and Noph to the city of Memphis, not in America, but of course in Egypt. It was a capital city. Both cities were intimately connected with Pharaoh Osirkon IV. In fact, his 22nd dynasty is often called the Tanite dynasty, after Tanis, because it was his power base. Gene Tucker, in his wonderful commentary, puts it like this: the prophet's indictment cites the princes of Zoan for their arrogance, for their claims to wisdom, and especially for their reliance on sages who have no idea of the plans of the Lord of hosts for Egypt. The next big section in these oracles concerning Egypt are 5 announcements. Chapter 19, verses 16 to 25. Most commentators believe that these shorter oracles come from a later period, when Jews had established themselves in the Nile Delta. Each oracle begins with a phrase, "on that day," and with the exception of the first oracle, are extremely positive towards Egypt. The second oracle says this: 5 towns speaking the language of Canaan and swearing oaths in the name of Yahweh Sabaoth. These are the immigrant Jews who attracted proselytes, or God-fearing people, into their midst. Jeremiah 44, verses 1 and 15, speaks of 5 places in Egypt to which Jews fled in the 6th century BC, while papyrus discoveries from a place called Elephantine near Aswan Dam show us a Jewish colony city, and it confirms a strong religious practice there. Interestingly, the name Ir Hahares is probably the city of Heliopolis, the city of the sun in Greek, so that even in the city of the sun god, the language of Canaan is spoken and the true God is acknowledged as against the sun god. The third oracle of these 5 is quite extraordinary. It has an altar of the Lord in the heart of Egypt. There was a temple of the Lord at Elephantine, that Jewish colony already mentioned, and another much later on, closer to the time of Jesus, at a place called Leontopolis. Further, it says this: the Egyptians, when in oppression, will cry out to the Lord. He will send them a Saviour to deliver them. Yahweh will love Egypt just as he loves Israel. I will reveal myself to them, and they will acknowledge me and worship me with sacrifices and offerings. Egypt will have the same relationship with God as Israel does. Isn't that magnificent, visionary, extraordinary? And the last 2 oracles are shorter and quite wonderful as well, concluding with the words, "Blessed be my people, Egypt, and Assyria, my creation, and Israel, my heritage." And then the last section of these oracles concerning Egypt is that prophetic action or sign I spoke about at the beginning, chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. It had seemed that Isaiah would have walked about the city, at least at certain times, in the guise of a prisoner of war, with practically nothing on. He wanted to prefigure in some way the downfall of the city Ashdod, or perhaps even Egypt,